So, hi everyone, and welcome. I'm Sheila Segerson, and I'm the Director of Research for Maddie's Fund, and my co-host is Kelly Dewar, Foster Care Specialist at Maddie's Fund. Our topic for this session, I'm super excited about, is sending them home, talking to potential adopters and fosters about dogs. And we're speaking to three amazing people at Austin Pets Alive. Hillary Ages, who manages the virtual foster program at APA. Anisha Mararka, who's on the behavior team at APA. And Laura Davis, who is a long-term and amazing volunteer at APA. I thought it was really nice for us to have at least one volunteer on the panel because many of you probably have volunteers who talk to potential adopters and fosters. So good to get her perspective as well. So that's it. I think we can go ahead and get started with our first question. Over to you, Kelly.
Okay. You guys have so many dogs, and most of them are dogs with behavioral complexity. How do you go about speaking to potential adopters about some of the dogs that you work with about these behavioral challenges? And does your relationship with them illuminate ways that you can help an adopter understand them or manage these behaviors in real life situations?
I guess I'm going to take that one first. Hi, everybody. Thank you for coming. So Austin Pets Alive is kind of a unique organization in that we tend to take only dogs who have behavior challenges, and everyone in our organization supports the idea of really trying to find these very special characters, the right place in the world where they can be successful. From my perspective, my personal involvement with an animal, when I'm advocating for it and I have a relationship with that dog, I get really excited to talk about them. And I think that for anyone who really loves a dog, that enthusiasm is contagious. And it's a really important component when it comes to talking about things that are difficult. So I think I personally always like to speak with a smile on my face. I prefer voice conversations to emails. I want someone to hear all the inflections in my voice when I think a dog does something funny or, you know, what kind of a character they are. And I'll always kind of lead with how much I love that animal. And there's absolutely some component of my relationship with the dog that comes through. But even if I don't know the dog super well, because we have 200 dogs, I can fake that a little bit, but I can still present my thoughts about the animal in a very positive way and lead with something that's fantastic and then get into the complexities after that. But let me give the other ladies some chance to talk as well.
Yeah, I am very much like Hillary. So I do build relationships with my dogs. I actually try to spend some time with my dogs outside of the shelter if I can, like take them on field trips or sleepovers or whatnot. So I can just learn what they're like in the home, just like their little quirks and whatnot. And it makes it a little easier for me to be able to talk to potential adopters or fosters, and also like sometimes how to manage those behaviors in the home. So I think really having a relationship with a dog does make it easier. I think potential fosters and adopters can also see it and feel it and hear it when you're talking about them too, when you have a connection with the dog. So yeah, I think it helps.
I agree. I think the relationship is really important. And I think for me, especially the ones that are really behaviorally complex, if you really understand the dog and understand kind of hopefully what they're thinking, then you can explain that to adopters that, you know, they might not understand why the dog's doing this or that. And you can explain it from the dog's point of view. And I think that's always been helpful for me.
Thank you, guys. All right, I'm going to jump on to our next question. And so you're in your very first conversation with a potential adopter. And what are some general recommendations you have in terms of general things that you make sure you talk about in a very first conversation, and things that you try to avoid talking about in a very first conversation?
For me, I tell my potential adopters everything. I just because the dogs that we deal with are very quirky and they do have a lot of needs. So I don't ever want a potential adopter to come in and think that, or like not hear the full picture of the dog and then like not completely understand the animal, or like get upset about coming in and meeting the dog and then just learning a bunch of other stuff about the dog. So I'm very honest and very blunt when I talk to potential adopters. I lay everything out for them so they know the full picture of the animal before they come to meet them or decide to move forward with meeting the dog.
Thank you, Laura or Hillary. Any comments?
I like to ask, I mean, my initial communication with someone is always an email first. And so in those emails, I'll ask just a baseline of questions like, are you in a home or are you in an apartment? Are there other animals? Are there children? Can you? And it's a really brief correspondence. I don't like, I think that in this day and age, nobody has the attention span for a great deal of information, unfortunately. I mean, we're like an Instagram society at this stage of the game. So I will open up a correspondence by saying, hi, I am this dog's best friend in the entire world, and I can tell you absolutely everything you want to know. But I just need a little bit of information. Where do you live? How many people are in the house? That kind of thing. So I can find out if I'm even interested in talking to them or if it's a waste of time because this dog will never work with 14 children. And if it appears that it's a good fit, in part of my initial conversations, I like to ask them what they're looking for in a dog and what would be a deal breaker. Like if you can't go to the dog park, but this dog will absolutely love you till the day you die and be your best friend, would that be a decent enough trade-off? So in my initial dialogues, it's a little bit of a ping pong game of seeing where I have room to maneuver to see if the conversation is worth pursuing. And I mean, as much as I want all the dogs that I love to go home, I don't want any dog that I love to go to the wrong home. So I'm advocating from the point of the animal and trying to communicate in an upbeat, easy way with the human, just to get a sense as to whether or not we're even on the same page and it's worth pursuing.
I think for me, I have an email response that to most inquiries that come in, I'll kind of give them a response that's the same thing. It'll pretty much say, this is who the dog is. This is, you know, the big challenges. This is why he's so wonderful. And I got a few key things like maybe the dog can't live with kids or cats or what have you. That way you're kind of just eliminating anyone that might not be a good fit. And then I think, especially for the more challenging dogs, if the person replies and they're interested and want to know more, then you kind of can take that as a cue as like they're ready to deal with the challenge, and then you can really talk in depth about it.
All right, this is probably a little bit of a trick question. How do you decide whether a potential adopter is the right person for your foster dog?
That is a trick question. It's completely unfair.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't ever know. Do you know? I don't know.
No.
I think you don't know if it's going to be the right person, but I think you know if that person is really going to do what's needed to take care of the dog and speak up for the dog if needed. It goes beyond just, you know, feeding and housing, but it's really thinking about the dog's emotional needs too.
But I've made so many mistakes about that kind of thing. Like I'll prejudge a situation if I'm sitting face to face and think, yeah, you're not right. And I have been wrong so many times. So sometimes that doesn't actually present, in my experience, but I may not be as intuitive as you are, honestly. I like gut first all the time. But oftentimes these people just don't know how to articulate what it is I'm looking to hear. And so I find that one of the things I think we all do, and you guys correct me if I'm wrong, but we want to set up multiple introductions to get a sense of what the relationship might look like. So the initial conversations are, I very much compartmentalize and have a formula when I'm advocating for a dog, but the initial dialogues are just weeding out, is there something wrong here that won't work? And if there's nothing, no bells and whistles going off in that department, I then want to bring it into like the voice-to-voice conversations and the actual introduction. And I think each facet of that process reveals different things to us. Like sometimes people end up being really ready to take on far more than I would have anticipated if they're really soft-spoken, or they, you know, tend to be a little more shy. So I don't know.
Yeah,
That's
so
a
I
hard
think
question.
it's a hard question, but I think your point is well taken, and be open-minded. And because that person with a child might be a veterinary behaviorist who has a ton of experience and can actually take that dog. So that's one aspect of things, being open-minded when you're not sure. But what about situations where you've talked to this potential adopter and you know they're not a good fit, but they're still pretty interested in that dog?
I think I had that happen recently, and I think I was able to just explain to them and say, like, listen, I'm concerned and here's why. And I even sent them some videos, and I didn't just outright say, like, no, I don't want you to have this dog. It was more of like, these are something I'm really concerned about. I feel like it's going to be difficult. Let's have a conversation and see, you know, how they felt about it. And I think they realized, like, well, it is maybe like way more than I expected. So I think just being upfront and honest and including any information you feel like might be the reason for a bad fit can help.
Yeah, I'm very similar to Laura too. Like, if I don't think they're fully understanding the dog, I will re-mention all of their things, their behavior concerns, management. I will be a lot more straightforward if I don't feel like they're understanding it. And I think they tend to just kind of weed themselves out. I haven't had to straight up tell somebody yet that they're not the right fit or that I can't send this dog with them. So they usually will know once you've told them enough about the animal if they can manage them or not.
I did have that experience happen a couple of weeks ago, actually. I just remembered where somebody was asking me about a dog, and it was absolutely not the right fit. And I was trying to be, you know, delicate and thoughtful in my response, and I was getting a lot of anger back. Well, is it better at the shelter, or how do you know what my house was? And when I explained to this person that we were actually talking about a foster dog that I've lived with for a year and a half, they softened and said, oh, so you really know this dog. And that changed the whole dynamic. And, you know, I offered to try to help find them a dog that I thought might be better. But that doesn't happen that often.
I think that's
Yeah.
a point of just letting them know, like, listen, I know this dog very well if you do. I mean, some of the dogs we advocate for, we might not know that well, but a lot of the ones that we have personal experience with, you know, it would be good for them to hear, like, hey, I've known this dog for, you know, a year, and we see each other 5 times a week, and I know I know what's going to be the best. So it's like, you don't want to come off as really just like, oh no, you're not right, but
Right.
you know the dog. So
Yeah, and I would certainly agree that most people, through your talking to them, they end up understanding that, oh yes, this isn't the right dog for me. But I've certainly had a few situations where the dog, over the years, where the people are convinced that they want this dog. And my tendency is, unless there is something that I am, 80% certain that I am putting this family at very significant risk, my tendency is to give those people a chance because they're really, really, really motivated to make it work. But what do you guys do?
Well, I think we're dealing with a population that many people may not be able to relate to, although I have to imagine anyone who's working with shelter dogs or foster dogs, there's always an animal that's going to be harder to place. In our world, every one of them is hard to place for the most part. So we are very much aware of what their histories entail and why certain things won't work. And I think every one of us is extremely candid with people about who these guys are. I think for all three of us, the stylistic differences may be different, the way that we approach the conversation may be different, but we're all going to talk candidly about who the animal is, what it needs to succeed, what the management actually looks like. If it's a good fit, I will go heavily into a conversation about all the options and support that's available and the kind of management that we're looking at for a dog to do well in a home. But I think that if it's not the right fit and you do start really explaining what the limitations of that scenario might be, people will often back off because it's a lot. It can be a lot to take on.
If I do have like a potential adopter who is still there, even after I've talked about all of their quirks and I've talked about management, I do give them a chance. You know, I do multiple meetings with them. I do training with them. And through that, it helps me either have confidence in them or maybe decide it really isn't the right fit. But I do try to give those adopters the benefit of the doubt. I've had a lot, not a lot, but there's been a couple adopters that I've not been so sure about, but knock on wood, you know, my dogs are still in homes. And so you work with them. And that's something that I also, and I know like Hillary and Laura the same way, like we provide that support for these adopters, even once those dogs go into those homes. So if, you know, they are having trouble, we're there for them. We help them out. We're, you know, a text or a phone call away to help them continue to have those animals in the home. So you can't just turn away and expect to have the perfect person for your dog because that person's probably not going to exist. But it's nice to have somebody that would be willing to work with your dog too, if it's not that exact home that you're looking for.
I think it's always good if you feel like they might agree that it's not the right fit after really living with the dog. I think just saying like, listen, let's try a foster to adopt situation, then I think it, you know, it resolves itself on its own and they get a really honest look at what it's like to live with a dog and what might not fit with their lifestyle.
Great, thank you. So our next question is from Sarah Aguilar. Thank you, Sarah. And actually, before I ask that question, just a reminder to everyone, if you have a question, you can raise your hand and we'll call on you to ask that question. And or you can type your question in the chat area and we'll get to you. Sarah, do you want to ask your question live?
Sure. I have a delay, so that's why I typed it.
I can hear you.
I was just wondering, since you guys are dealing with that sort of harder population, like you don't have a whole bunch of just like easy peasy green dot plug and play pets. Do you think that the community that's calling, looking to adopt already has kind of an understanding of that? Or is that only like, to me, being outside of Austin and knowing how successful APA is, like I know what it is, right? But does the average person in your community have that understanding?
It's a really good question. I'm not sure I have the answer, but I'll take a stab at it. I think that what we see in Austin is an acceptance of the blocky-headed breeds. I don't think that necessarily means that people understand what our mission statement is and the range of complexities that we're dealing with. One of the things I've become really aware of, because I speak to so many people to place dogs, is that, you know, for a really long time, it was always, we got to find a unicorn home. We got to find it. It's so hard. We can't find this dog. It's so difficult. It needs this, this, and this. And over time, I've come to realize that most people are really lonely and looking for a best friend. And when you can plug them into not so much the behavior of an animal, but the context as to how they ended up in this situation to begin with, and the poor choices they've made in the past, and what we've done to rehabilitate them and where they are in their lives now, or liken them to be an emo kid or a naughty teenager, or things that sound like real human speak, that they're far more receptive. And I personally have placed, I think at this point, throughout all the dogs that I'm affiliated with, dozens of dogs who are hard to place. And when you talk to people about, but you may not be able to have parties at your house with a lot of people and expect this dog to be comfortable, but you are going to wake up covered in kisses. And this animal has so much to offer. Where are you willing to make trade-offs? That those kinds of things soften those behavior conversations, and anybody understands that. I don't think that Austin adopters, unless they've adopted from us before, come in with a preconceived understanding of exactly what we're dealing with here. Does that help answer your question? Sort of.
Yeah, and so we got a nod, and then Beth commented thank you, Beth. As a first-time foster having a small dog, I had tons of inquiries from people who didn't realize that APA was different than any other shelter. And I've been to lots of different shelters, and there's certainly something unique about Austin. There's something unique about every single city in the United States. But I'd say the most unique part is how the culture at Austin, in Austin, and Austin Pets Alive is a culture of talking about the dogs in ways that really help you to understand and feel for the dog, instead of using language that alarms people. And so being open and honest, but using words that don't shut people down, is what I see as the biggest difference.
Absolutely. Should we, are there any other comments on that one? All right. How do you talk about a bite history?
Very carefully. Sorry, go ahead.
I think with that one, I've always found that most likely if it's a dog you're advocating for, you have this relationship with the dog, you understand why it happened, and telling the doctor why, and just giving them kind of what happened through the dog's mind. That way they can understand, like, well, it's gonna happen because of this, not just because he's crazy and just gonna bite me. It's understanding the sequence behind what happened. And I think also talking to people about the management that is needed to make sure it doesn't happen again, I think is helpful for them to either realize, like, well, that might be a little bit too much for me, or like, oh no, this is like, that's not a big deal. I can do this. All I have to do is keep him away from cats. So it can be something as simple as that, or like with things that might be more complex, I think it takes a lot of time to help them understand the nuances of like dog's body language, things like that. But I think we're always able to say why it happened and how to deal with it or prevent it.
Yeah, definitely giving context around the bite and what triggered it, and yeah, management, or what to do, what not to do, or what we've learned to like help this dog. I know some of my dogs that I've advocated for that have landed bites, like we just look, they might have been put in certain situations that shouldn't have been put in, and just like talking to potential adopters about, okay, let's not put those dogs in those situations again. And, or this dog is like not a party animal, it's more of a homebody. And if you take him out on a boat party with people they don't want to be around, like they're going to get nervous, they're going to get uncomfortable, and then they're going to bite when somebody puts their face in their face. So, like giving context around it and letting them know like why a dog did a certain thing. And yeah, I think it really helps for adopters and fosters to wrap their head around it.
I also will, like, I'm highly manipulative when it comes to conversations about dogs. So I will very deliberately, I always lead with the good stuff first. So, my conversations will be like, I freaking love this animal. It is such an extraordinary little character. And I'll start to like backtrack from there. And then at some point, because they've all got bite histories, I don't know any dogs without bite histories. That's kind of a scary thought. But at some point, I will use the words, I'm not going to lie, this dog has used his mouth inappropriately. I don't ever start by saying there is a bite history, because it's too big a concept without having given context first, in my opinion. So I will talk about, this is an animal who was put in a situation that was absolutely going to be provocative for it. It was, it is clearly a dog that is fearful, and, a defensive behavior is also when you'll see a dog put its teeth on a human. That's my second tier. So I'll go from use its mouth inappropriately, put its teeth on a human, but it really didn't bleed very much. I kind of like soften it a little bit, but then I'll say, so we are talking about a dog who has bitten in the past, but given the circumstances around it, it's not so far-fetched to understand. And the other thing is, I'll always say, this is the only way a dog can communicate if it's feeling threatened is, you start with barking. If you don't heed barking, you're going to start maybe seeing lunging. And if you don't heed lunging and they're telling you to go away, then it's really a natural way for them to express themselves. I don't know that everybody else talks that way, but to me, it makes perfect sense. And I always feel like I wouldn't want somebody to describe me based on my notes or the worst things I've done in my life, because no one would adopt me ever. So I would rather someone say when she was a teenager, she did this really stupid thing. So that's kind of like how I build my little ladder into, look, we've covered all of these things. So that there are 3 bites. This one happened this way, this one happened this way. And I find that almost always by the time the conversation is done, they're not walking away if it's something that makes sense to them. Most of the 90% of the time.
Thank you. And I think really good thoughts from you guys so far. And I really like talking about it in terms of discussing how dogs communicate as well, because people hear words about dogs doing bad things and automatically assume that the dog is evil. And when you talk about it related to communication, and it's the only way they can communicate, sometimes people really, in my experience, tend to understand that. Anything else to add on that one? We're good. All right. Before we get to our next question, I'm going to ask all of you to type in your chat area. If you could type in the chat where you're from and what shelter you're working with, if you're comfortable, or organization you're working with, if you're comfortable doing that. I meant to ask that earlier, but would love to see where everybody comes from. And while everyone is typing in their chat, our next question is going to come from Amanda, and I think Amanda is willing to ask her question live. So I am trying to unmute you, Amanda, but it's not working. Kelly, can you try to unmute Amanda? Maybe she doesn't have audio. Maybe she doesn't have a microphone. All right, I'm going to ask your question for you because I can't seem to unmute you. Sorry about that. So Amanda's question is, how do you encourage adopters to consider adopting a dog that's strongly bonded with a foster or bestie from the shelter, especially when the dog has issues forming bonds with humans?
I can take a stab at that one. I think it's past few dogs I've advocated for have been very bonded to one person and had a hard time meeting new people. And I like to start off by telling the potential adopters, just say, listen, this dog's life up until this point is just full of uncertainty and meeting lots of new people. And once you start forming a friendship with the dog, that becomes something that they begin to know. And with all of this uncertainty in the world, there's a person that's going to be continuously kind of coming back. And so that's obvious that they're going to bond with a person. But in terms of how that bond will be in their home, I think you can show them, like, listen, this is what the dog likes to do when he trusts you, or once you get to that point. I think you never want people to think like, oh, this dog is just going to be a cuddly teddy bear as soon as he moves in with me. I think it's really about letting them know kind of what that process is like. And even if you need to, you can say, you know, in the beginning when I first met this dog, he was very aloof and didn't pay attention to me. And they'll see, like, now the dog is curled up in your lap or something. And so I think it helps them understand it's not like you have this magical thing. It's something that develops over time for a reason. And I also like to use words like, say you're doing an Instagram post or something, instead of saying something like, oh, this dog loves to cuddle me and sit in my lap, you can talk about, you know, this dog, when he bonds with someone, he likes to da-da-da. And so you're using the words you and kind of putting them in your shoes instead of, this is what I feel and I'm the best friend. I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah, that's a great suggestion. Thank you, Laura. Any
And
other
I
thoughts
think
there?
we also, I often will have a best friend come into an intro with an adopter. We may have a neutral person introduce a dog first. If there's a concern about the dog. I don't know if that question from Amanda was, if someone feels like they're pulling the dog away from someone they love by taking them. That's how I read it to be. But starting with something neutral on, you know, on the heels of what Laura is saying, and then having a best friend come in so that they can actually see the difference between a dog who's not comfortable with a stranger and a dog who is able to form a bond in a relationship. I'm not sure exactly what the question was asking, but I'll throw that out there too.
That's a good point, of especially for the dogs that have handling sensitivities, or you have to say, I'm going to introduce you to this dog, please don't touch this dog.
Yeah.
It can help to have that neutral presence that is also a person that can't touch that dog. And so it's kind of like, you know, you'll see the person that has a relationship with the dog and the people that haven't yet formed that relationship.
Yeah, and also, like, answering your question, Amanda, like, why don't the bestie or the foster adopt? Like, they're a bestie and a foster. Maybe there's something in their life that they can't adopt the dog, or they're just fostering, or that's what they do for dogs, is they just foster. So, like, letting adopters know, like, the ultimate goal is to get these dogs adopted and into homes. And so, yeah, like, I mean, we all have so many dogs that we advocate for, and we can't adopt all of them. It's just not possible. And so, like, letting them know that we're helping them transition into a more permanent home. But yeah, just letting them know, like, the final, that end outcome is for adoption, and like the bestie and the foster are kind of like in the process, or helping the dog along in their journey to get to that forever home.
Okay. Sandy, you had a question, and I was, would you like to ask live? No, okay. All right. She was asking, do you discuss the 3 days, 3 weeks, and 3 month changes?
Don't think so. I think go ahead, Kelly.
There is, I have heard this before, that dogs, you know, a dog is different at 3 days than they are at 3 weeks than they are at 3 months. I think that's really simplifying it.
I don't really talk about like the 3 day, 3 week, 3 month, but I talk about like a decompression time. So like the dog is going to come into your home. Don't expect it to be everything or what you want it to be right off the bat, and that there's going to be like a gradual change. But I never give like an actual timeline for it, just because every dog's a little different on how quickly they adjust. I have some dogs that, you know, they spend one night and they're fine the next day. I have some that take a while before their adopter or foster can like really cuddle with them or interact with them. But just letting them know, like blanket statement, this dog's going to need time to decompress in your home from the shelter stress or going from one foster home to another home or whatnot.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point, Anisha. The 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months thing is obviously based in the concept of a dog adjusting to a home, but there is some myth around it in that probably about 17 years ago, I talked in a lecture about 3 days, 3 weeks, 3 months, and then somehow it kept getting talked about more and more and more. And there's no research behind it. I thought at the time, which is a long time ago, that was a good general time to think about changes and about following up with dogs, but we don't have research to say that's when changes happen. So Anisha, thanks for talking about that related to every dog's an individual and just expecting that every dog's going to be different.
I think on that point, it's good to be able to talk to adopters about this is what to expect in the first, like I always say, like the first phase. And it's probably a similar sort of like the first phase, the dog's going to be probably terrified and do this, and here's how to help manage. And then the sort of like, then you get to this phase and just really helping the adopter know how to realize when they're at that point, I think. I don't know if that makes sense.
All right, let's jump to our next question. And our next question, I'm trying to decide where we should go next. If you have a question, please type it into the chat area. How about, if a dog is afraid or defensive with strangers, how do you introduce them to an adopter? We'll probably spend a whole day talking about this.
Defensive, scaredy dogs are my favorite. Those are the ones that I advocate for. I do very slow introductions. I usually do like a tandem walk with them, so it's less intimidating for the dog. I'll usually handle them, and then depending on how the dog's doing, then I'll do like a leash pass off when they're not really looking and still kind of stick around. Obviously telling the adopters or fosters, do not touch this dog, do not try to pet it, and doing multiple very non-invasive, non-intimidating intros with them. And then just letting them know, like, and then kind of back to what Laura was talking about earlier, then having that relationship and like touching them and petting them and interacting with them so they can see what they can eventually get to. But knowing that this dog is scared, defensive, going slow with it, you know, you may not have your 100% relationship with them until they're in your home, but just like making them understand it's going to be a little bit of a process with a scaredy defensive dog.
I had an interesting experience a couple of months back. Please forgive the whining of the monster in my house. It's my background noise. There was a dog that I had introed many, many, many times who's exceptionally defensive. And I always used to have adopters kind of toss treats away from them so that it would encourage the dog to move away and not, we have so many dogs that we see that will act as though they want to say hello, throw their arms around someone's neck, and then take a taste of them. And, you know, it's, unfortunately, it happened to me recently. But this dog would be lovely and welcoming as long as there was food in the picture. And then one of our very savvy behavior team members said, you really should take the food out of the equation because you're not getting an honest read on the level of the dog's anxiety and discomfort in the situation, which I thought, Jesus, I wasn't smart enough to come up with that. That's really good advice. And because what happened was the dog was being lovely until the treats went away. And then he snapped at the adopters like, I'm not getting what I want, and now I'm really mad. So in the you know, introductions that I did with the same animal who's now happy and tucked away in a home, I didn't include food at all. And I think, you know, as with all dogs, every one of them is different, and you really have to know, you know, you have to use safety first. I think a tandem walk is a wonderful way to introduce a dog, as opposed to in the loud, stressful environment of the shelter, where they're already feeling kind of on edge, especially if you know the dog well and there are new people in the yard. But kind of doing a neutral situation where they have the ability to walk and come in and out and say hello without getting too close, and to not bribe them, to make everyone seem like they're wonderful and make the dog give you a false read, it was a really valuable lesson for me. Anyway.
Awesome. I totally agree. They are really super helpful. Emily, would you like to ask your question?
Basically, you know, looking at the shift with APA over the past couple months and how fewer dogs there are on site, do y'all see like this kind of being a lasting impact with, you know, more people working from home because of COVID, or do you see this being a good kind of a blessing in disguise for fostering, if that makes sense?
Hopefully.
For sure, it certainly has allowed a number of very complex animals to leave and shine in a lot of ways, I think. I think that we didn't have a choice, and the dogs have been well prepared. They have been loved and trained, and they are ready. And this just gave them their opportunity to go. So I don't think we've had any kind of organization-wide conversation about how that's going to look moving forward, because I don't think we know anything about what's happening yet in the world. But knowing APA, I'm sure it will inform what we do in the future.
And another thought about it is that, you know, nationwide for the last 100 years or so, we've realized that humans being institutionalized just doesn't really work for us. And it seems to me like it was always kind of coming toward this point. COVID might have kind of sped it up, but you know, we've gotten, you know, we're deinstitutionalized humans in like just about every form, and, you know, orphanages and you know, things like that. And so seeing this change for animals just makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, and I'm just gonna jump on this really quickly because it's my very, very favorite topic these days, and that's that so many of the adult dogs that come to us have trauma histories and some type of trauma in their background, whether it be being abandoned by their family versus having serious medical problems when they were a puppy versus having the lack of a support system when they were tiny dogs. So many different things can cause dogs to experience significant emotional trauma, just like so many things. You know, how many of us here don't have trauma in our backgrounds? We all do, right? And dogs do too. And I think putting dogs with a trauma history into an environment where they're being exposed to things that cause more trauma, like barking dogs next to them and not having any control over their environment, I think we all know that's not the right thing for our dogs. So it's really not a question of whether we're going to keep doing this, because we are going to keep doing this, right? We have to do it for our dogs, and we just all have to work together. And for those of you who haven't heard about the Human Animal Support Services program that is being launched from American Pets Alive, and many shelters around the country are starting to work on, I put the website in the chat area, definitely go check it out. All right, and I will jump to our next question. And that next question comes from Claire, who says, I have a foster who has been a challenging one, He is playful and snuggly, but he doesn't get along with one of my dogs and has attacked her. We have to keep them separate. He's jumped over my fence and run away. I'm having a hard time because I feel like adopters want a perfect dog. What do I do? So what do we do in situations like this where
So I think part of, I'm not going to answer this question directly, so don't get frustrated with me, but I do have a thought pattern that makes sense in my own head anyway. When one of the things that we have been trying to implement when it comes to placing dogs is that whatever description of them there is on a website is factual and authentic. And so if you have a dog that's fearful or has the capacity to take a powder at any given turn or open door, you want to say that in a fun way, in a description about the animal. So, I mean, for us, we don't want to adopt dogs out to homes with a lot of kids that might leave a door open if they are heavy flight risks. But I think that trying to address the behavior while trying to explain some of that behavior to an adopter in a way that isn't just it's a negative, but here's what we think we need to place it well. And to make sure that whatever description is on whatever website is the host for the dog, for your shelter, that their bio is actually accurate. I'm going to pass this off to you, Anisha.
Sorry. So yeah, so like the jumping fences or like having I try to relate to humans sometimes. So like if they're looking for a perfect dog, I do tell them like, you and I are not perfect. We have our own behaviors, we have our own things, we have our like issues that we work on ourselves, and that's kind of what the dog is going to be like. Yes, they might have these concerns, these behaviors, but there are going to be ways that you can manage them or work with them. So like jumping fences, you know, either putting a long line on them or having somebody always out there watching them. That would be one thing. As far as not getting along with like the dog that's in the home, talking about slow introductions with other dogs, or you know, maybe this dog doesn't want to be around other dogs, it just wants to be the only dog in the home and he wants all the love and affection and doesn't want to share. So you know, it's hard to say that one dog's not perfect, but that dog might be perfect for a certain person. So a lot of the dogs that like we advocate for are not perfect by any means, but there is like an adopter out there that's willing to deal with those and to manage those. And I think sometimes just like pulling in the human part of it and talking about like how we ourselves are not this ideal thing that everybody wants to be, the dog's not going to be the same way. And I think it kind of makes adopters step back a little bit and be like, oh yeah, like that totally makes sense. I mean, we do have a lot of people that will be like, I want a dog that can go to dog parks and can go to patio bars and can have parties at my house and blah, 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 blah. But I mean, unless you get a puppy, you're really not going to find an older dog that can handle that. So just talking to them about your dog's needs, and it also helps weed out those people that won't be a good fit for them. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, I think I think having the expectations of like, this is what the dog needs, the dog isn't perfect, that will, like Anisha said, weed out the people that might not be a good fit, because if they're looking for a perfect dog, they might not be patient with the fact that he's gonna bark at other dogs walking by or pee on the carpet. Or you want someone that's really looking at the dog as a whole. And sorry, my dogs are fighting in the background and I can't think. But they are willing to work with that. You know,
All right, do we have any more questions from the audience? We have a few more here, but I just want to make sure we get everybody's questions who are here. Okay. All right. It can be really challenging to talk to potential adopters about dogs when we have so many dogs. I don't know many of them at all. What can I do to help safely place dogs in homes when I don't know them that well?
Wait, so is that somebody from a shelter who it doesn't have any history or information at, if that's what it sounds like?
Yeah, so think about high volume shelters that
Yeah.
aren't able to get dogs out much.
That's a good question. Personally, unfortunately, I don't have that much um, experience with dogs that I don't know, but I have done that before, and I try to talk about what kinds of things you want to look for potentially and how you welcome any new dog into your home and some of the things that you can expect and just basic logistics of what shelter trauma can produce in an animal and some of the responses. And it's not the 3-day, 3-week, 3-month, but that oftentimes a dog who's been in a shelter will come home and sleep for a week or not eat for several days, and not to be surprised if a dog can be a little shut down. And I'll talk mostly about the transition out of shelter life into home life, and that is because that is true for any shelter animal for the most part, as far as I know. We tend to offer the ability to give support to people once they take a dog home. I don't think everybody is able to facilitate that. But I would stick to the broad strokes. And I mean, obviously you sort of you're trying to place them. I think there's a lot of it you have to hope for the best, right? Because you don't really know the animals or have any history.
Thank you, Hillary. I'll add a little bit on that. Don't know, Anisha or Laura, if you have anything to add, but the other thing to think about, even if you're in a high volume shelter, as your dogs, you have longer stay. Most of us have some longer stay dogs in the shelter. Those are the dogs that when they're staying longer than an average dog, there might be a reason that is happening. It may be just because you haven't told the public about it, and that's really easy. But really, when you have these longer stay dogs, start programs so that your volunteers can get to know the dogs if you don't have staff, but start programs so that you can get to know the dogs, because that's really what's going to help them. All right, and we are getting ready to wrap up here. This has been a great session, Hillary, Laura, and Anisha. I really, really appreciate everything that you guys have talked about. Any last words from you guys in terms of something that we haven't talked about that you want everybody to know to make it easier for us to help these perfectly imperfect dogs?
Yeah, I guess like one thing is, obviously a lot of our dogs have histories. Maybe they've been surrendered because of separation anxiety or, reactivity or whatnot on leash. And at least at the shelter, what we can do with the dogs that we advocate for, we work on those behaviors with these dogs to like help them become their better self. And it's going to be important that you talk to like potential adopters or fosters on how you've worked on these behaviors and help those dogs even more to be their better selves. So that way they're not just hearing all this like bad stuff about the dog and, negative, but hey, there's this, like I've worked on X, Y, and Z with this animal and they've made great improvements. And if you continue to do this stuff, they can continue to be a good dog for you. So, it's hard sometimes when you've got so much behavior issues with dogs, but definitely bringing in the positive things that you've done with them, I think will really help potential adopters and fosters see a dog's potential.
I want to just add that one of the things that has been very successful for us over the last, at least in the virtual foster program, has been adding different layers of communication and teaching the volunteers how to communicate with adopters has built an army of really savvy humans that can really take a lot of the volume of this very labor-intensive process of a very large population of animals. And we have at least 200 dogs on our property pre-COVID, of course, but if you educate your volunteers and you teach them to kind of focus on certain animals or the ones who have the potential to stay longer, get to know them, train them, build a relationship with them, create Instagram accounts for them, get great media and great bios that are not misleading. That's really important, that you're not talking about animals in a way that is just a false representation and frustrates people when they actually meet them. That's really an important thing to bring in the right adopter for a dog that's expecting what they're actually going to be meeting. And use the power of the volunteers that love the animals, because they are invaluable.
I think one thing I'd want to add is, if your shelter has the programs, or even if the dog has a really good friend that's willing to let the adopter know that you're there for them, if they take the dog home and a problem arises, and someone else might know the dog really well and understand what to do. And so if you can just let them know, like, hey, we're here, you're not in this on your own. I'm not just sending you home with this really complicated dog and saying good luck. I think just being there for them when they need it is helpful.
Thank you so much, Hillary, Laura, and Anisha. I really appreciate your expertise today. And thank you, everyone, for joining us and sharing your evening. I know we're all kind of exhausted of meetings and everything, and it's really nice to see everybody tonight. And have a good night.